Wow. Okay. So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this event. I would like to start by giving some thanks to CIB for arranging this and hosting it with us, and also to the Egyptian Business Pavilion for giving us use of these fantastic facilities. Thank you. I'll just say a few words of introduction, and then I will invite our keynote speaker to give an opening address. And then we've got a really great panel to discuss the topic. And what is the topic for today? So the topic is that, well, we've all come together to really discuss what the case is for banks in developing countries to commit to net zero. In the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we just launched our first progress report on Wednesday, and it showed fantastic progress with our members setting targets. We now have grown to 122 banks. But one of the issues that we have is that our representation in Africa and in the Middle East is very low. So we only have 2 members in Sub-Saharan Africa and 2 members in the MENA region. And we want to know how we can bridge that gap. We worry that there is a bit of a perception that the net zero mission is a bit elitist and maybe more suited to banks in developing countries. And we want to kind of use this as an opportunity to take stock of where we are now and really think forward about where we want to be by the time we have COP28 in the UAE next year. So, we have a real opportunity to step up and support and drive progress in less developed countries, but how do we do that? And that's what we want to discuss today, is to think about what kind of support is needed, what does it look like, and how we mainstream net zero and democratize it. And so it's with great pleasure that I invite up to the stage Her Excellency Dr. Armani Abizaid, Commissioner for Infrastructure, Energy and Digitalisation of the African Union, and also a board member of CIB.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Allow me at the outset to thank the Alliance, to thank CIB, and indeed all those who allowed for this session to take place, including the venue. And to commend you all for bringing to the fore this very important initiative and work, given that we are in this COP discussing implementation and the actions. And of course, implementation actions cannot take place without finance. And banking is an important partner in the work that we all do. With your permission, Sarah, I have a few words to say prior to our maybe some Q&A. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I greet you all on behalf of the African Union Commission and of course on my own behalf very pleased to discuss this innovative initiative that will help mobilize banks across the world to accelerate investments and actors towards addressing climate change. Access to finance remains one of the most crucial pillars to implementation and to implement particularly climate actions at the global, regional, and national and local levels. The paucity of funds to address climate change is also being compounded by the economic losses and damages from extreme weather events. Currently, extreme weather events are costing the globe around $140 to $300 billion per annum. The future costs of adaptation at the global level are also estimated between 200 to 500 billion per year from here to 2050. The currently low levels of financing for climate change mitigation and adaptation, mostly impacting developing economies, is threatening the net zero agenda. Despite the huge needs, climate finance flows globally only reached 632 billion in 2019-2020, of which only 20 billion out of the 632, 20 billion only flowed to Africa. Given the huge financial needs and gaps, it will be important to mobilize both domestic and international finance from the public, private sectors, including innovative financing. That is why the Net Zero Banking Alliance is welcome, which will help to put financiers at the forefront of the global net zero agenda. However, I must say I was a little bit surprised that out of the 119 signatory banks to this innovative initiative, only 3 are African banks. This is one of the key regions where climate finance flows are most needed. Despite the currently low representation of African banks, it is important for the Alliance to focus climate finance flows to Africa. The Alliance could also focus on creating awareness amongst policymakers and African banks on the opportunities and markets presented by this initiative. I would also like to recommend that the Alliance creates mechanisms and frameworks that will make it easy for African banks to join and to thrive within this initiative. Most importantly, I would like to call on the Alliance to ensure that the frameworks and conditions for financing that will be developed take into account the peculiarities and the specific needs of each region. It should be recalled that Africa only got 2% of CDM projects, mainly due to stringent conditions placed on mobilizing climate financing from carbon markets. Regions such as Africa, pressed with huge challenges and needs, including energy access, infrastructure development, poverty reduction, food security, etc., in addition to being the most vulnerable region of the world in terms of impact of climate change. Africa needs a development space within the framework of the net zero agenda to address its development challenges, at least in the short to medium terms. Taking the energy sector, for example, more than 600 million Africans still lack access to electricity, and 900 million Africans lack access to clean cooking. The current levels of consumption of electricity per capita, maybe you've read this article in The Economist last week, the average consumption of electricity of on an African is almost equal to a fridge in the US. It is therefore an imperative for Africa to use all available measures and resources to accelerate our energy access at the local, national, regional, and even the continental levels. As the continent with the lowest energy consumption and growing energy demands, the immediate goal for Africa is not about choosing between energy resources and systems, but ways the continent could strike a balance in meeting the energy demands in the short, medium, and long term using a combination of both renewable and non-renewable resources. It will be important for the Alliance to take these into account in designing their frameworks for our region. Maybe I will stop here, and I would welcome any comments, questions, and I thank you again for having me among you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Dr. Amani. Thank you. Any questions from the floor for Dr. Amani?
Do you have a figure as how much is needed to entice or drive renewables in Africa?
Turn off yours.
Thank you.
Yeah. Not renewables, not just renewables, but for energy in general. Because as I mentioned, our energy mix still has and will still have in the short and medium term at least natural gas. That is for sure. So for energy, yes, we need between 90 to 120 billion every year.
Every
But
year.
let me away from the figures. For Africa to have universal access, I mean, for everybody to have access to electricity and for everybody to have clean cooking is equal to an LNG terminal in Europe.
Wow. An energy terminal, a single one?
An LNG, a single one terminal in Europe. So you make the calculations, but just that.
Bear with me. There is a point that I want to get at, because the classical argument on part of developing countries is that we cannot give up cheap energy, which is gas or oil or fossil fuel, because it is cheap. However, when I think of Africa and see the renewables, whether solar or wind, and they could be much cheaper, they are there. I mean, the sun never stops shining in Africa. Why not leapfrogging into the new way of generating energy? And at that point, it would be even cheaper for us than fossil fuel. No.
It's a good point. If we were follow, yeah, it's a good point if we were following your logic, but it's not cheaper. And the logic is not about being cheap or expensive. Actually, fossil fuel is expensive now. And we have 18 countries that produce, for instance, natural gas. So are we saying to those producing gas, just give them to Europe, but do not use them in your own country?
Will not give it?
No, no, I'm sorry. Do not, allow me to, it's a rhetorical question. So what is happening now, it's as if we're saying, oh, it's okay to give it to Europe, but you're not allowed to use it for yourself. No, we're going to use it for ourselves as well. We may export some, but we're going to use it for ourselves as well. Same thing for renewables. And what people do not know, and often because the stories about Africa are often negative, Africa, the share of renewables in Africa's energy mix is 40%. That's the highest in the world. That's higher than the global average. It is higher than Europe. This is higher from Japan is 18, the US, the UK, you name it. We're doing a great job. And we have 22 African countries that rely mainly on renewables for their source of energy, mainly hydro. But we also have the whole of Horn of Africa that is now 40% of their energy comes from geothermal energy. So what we're saying is that it's no one solution fit all. But in the foreseeable future, at least the short and medium, we still need the natural gas as a base load for many countries. Maybe geothermal energy could serve as base load maybe for the whole of Africa, but this is not the story of everybody. So this is one point. The second point, I would very much appreciate that when we talk about Africa, we omit this expression leapfrogging. We're not in a world of frogs, and we are not marching to anyone's tune into whatever we want to. So please, I object completely to the word leapfrog, but I take your point about maybe bypassing certain technologies to move to another one. And yes, we are doing that as we speak. Look at this country. Look at any other country actually across the continent. All our countries, without exception, have renewable programs. So what our common position, the political common position that was adopted by the African Union in July, is that we continue to improve the share of renewables in our energy mix as fast and as best we can. Knowing that this mix also will include, and we are looking for it to include even nuclear power. Nuclear power is zero emission, and the new reactors are far much safer than the early ones. So we are not omitting any solution. but we are not necessarily following the same path others have been following. We are growing country by country, region by region, even zone by zone. It's not a micro grid cannot definitely cannot serve an industrial zone, but it's good for a remote village. So we are not omitting anything, but as we speak, in a practical and realistic way, away from prices. Practical and realistic, it is not foreseeable. It's not foreseeable in the short term and in the medium term. And this morning I was on another panel with captains of the industries, all of them without exception. No, I recognize that it's not a switch where we can turn it on and off. But we continue improving our energy mix. And by the way, all African Union projects are renewable. 2 days ago, we launched also with the African Development Bank and Africa 50, the African Green Infrastructure Initiative. And it's an initiative, and this is where I would also like to invite the Alliance to join. It's an initiative that we have set with institutional finance, international institutional finance, with multilaterals around the world. And we are raising $10 billion that will, 500 million would go into project preparation, 10 billion would go into green infrastructure, and to bring them to financial closure and to projects that could be implemented within 3 to 4 years maximum. We want things that move fast. So maybe you read the press release today, I think it came out today, and get to know this initiative a little bit more. I think that would be also an opportunity, because we want the private sector definitely, and banks are part of that, to join this fantastic initiative.
One last question, Malish.
That's
That's a very precious
excuse me, no,
intervention.
let me take from someone else. You and I, we see each other so many times, but let us maybe hear it from someone else. Thank you.
If I may, Your Excellency, thank you very much for those interesting comments. One of the topics that seems to be percolating in the back of a lot of discussions at COP has been around whether, as you mentioned, I think I've seen a figure that to get Africa to net zero will require around $3 trillion, which sounds like
Sorry, what?
$3 trillion
Yeah.
net zero completely across everything, which is a big number. But as you sort of rightly challenge, I think that number in terms of the global amount of investment flows is not necessarily significant. There's been a lot of discussion about whether the sort of Bretton Woods institutions, which were set up really to reconstruct Europe post-Second World War, need reform in order to catalyze that money as much as possible into places like Africa. I wondered if you had a thought on terms of maybe not just what the multilaterals need to do to change, but how does the private sector also need to change to come to work more closely with the multilaterals to drive capital into Africa and really accelerate a just transition?
Mm-hmm. About the Bretton Woods institutions, it's not about restructuring the Bretton Woods institutions. It's about creating new instruments and innovative instruments, and they're doing that all the time. It's just that, how would I say? Let me answer a different way. The pressure all of us are having now from the communities, from the daily lives that we are living, from everybody will make it. And this is where I don't want to sound cynical, but sometimes, actually all the time, crises are excellent to give solutions. Push everybody to think outside the box and to do what they should have done maybe 10 years before, but were reluctant. Like COVID. I spent, I don't know how many years, trying to push for the digital transformation. Everyone thought it was good to have. In 2 weeks' time, the whole world was on Zoom. The whole world was exchanging money with an application. Whether you're poor, whether you're rich, this is how it works. And now everybody knows it's part of the daily life. You cannot do without. So, as tragic as the crises are, but I'm convinced, starting from this crop, seeing also the pressure of people, the pressure that politicians, the commitment they are making because also they are under pressure from their constituency and from the life we are living. We'll find a solution. And here you are banks. And I'm asking you banks, what are you doing? Even CIB. CIB is through since 2013 started sustainability, one of the first probably in Africa that started this program. But to put it into action, to put it into projects to convince the public and the private sector, I would say it's only over the last 2 years, 3 years that it picked up. Not to mention that all the notion of ESG, and still is, by the way, people are still, and the financial system is still grappling with the exact definition. What constitutes a climate finance? What constitutes it? What do we mean exactly by governance? It will come. So I have no doubt, and it will come faster than we think. So it's not about restructuring the institution, but it's about we live in a critical moment. It's a departure from, like COVID was departure from pre-digital to digital era. I think the war in Ukraine is a departure from pre-climate to climate, and also into energy security, not just access, but security. And that's topping the agenda for everybody, energy security. Now, to the point regarding bringing together the private sector or the institutional finance to the multilateral finance, often it's cited that there is the element, and we need blend finance. We need So this is a role that multilaterals can play, and this is why in the initiative we launched, we thought that it is important to have them on board. Even the private sector is under pressure, and everyone, whether it's marketing or whether it's through convention, they have to put ESG. They have to invest in climate. Fine, even if it's just for marketing, but with time they will make it. So I'm very hopeful, and especially seeing what is happening here in COP, I'm extremely hopeful. But I may, or I could discuss the issue of risk in another forum, because it's an artificial excuse.
Thank you. Do we have time for one last question? We have one from James there. Thank you.
Thank you. You spoke to them in the fact that Africa has contributed the least in terms of climate emissions and is getting, bearing the brunt of it. So whereas mitigation can be difficult choices, I mean, adaptation and resilience, I mean, it's critical. And there are some things, so if you take, for example, land use and agriculture, maybe opportunities through resilience, regenerative agriculture, building in different ways of different practices, build more resilience through water, droughts, other kind of things, and also at the same time go even better than net zero from a climate mitigation point of view. Some of these opportunities. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how those kind of opportunities could be optimized, and what you feel the finance sector in particular could most contribute to be able to accelerate it.
Yeah, I wish my colleague, Commissioner for Agriculture, was here, but when you come to the blue zone, you can meet her. I agree with you. It takes two things to do that. And they are critical, by the way. It's not just about land and agriculture. One, digital, so e-agriculture and energy for processing. Because it's not just about agriculture; it's about food processing. Without those two, we'll still remain, with the traditional ancestral, like millennial. We'll go nowhere. So whether it's about water management, whether it's about agriculture, it's important to make sure that technology is there. It is critical that energy is there. And this is one more reason when we talk about to push for energy and energy access. I mean, what do you think caused the food insecurity? It's not just about it is energy. it is energy and fertilizers. And that's why I'm very happy and proud that we have 8 African countries that are producing green hydrogen and soon also green ammonia for food security. Well, and since I'm talking about that, we also have 4 African countries who are about or very soon already taking steps to produce sustainable aviation fuel. So we're also riding the wave. We're riding the wave.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Dr. Ramani. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Pleasure to have been with you and wish you an excellent session. Thank you.
So if I may now invite the panel up to the stage, that would be great. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So, starting from my left, I would like to introduce Dr. Dalia Abdelkader from CIB. Dalia is their Chief Sustainability Officer. Next to Dalia is Alex Mickey from the GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. And Alex is the Executive Director for mobilizing capital to emerging markets and developing countries. Then we have, to my left, Wendy Dobson. She is the Head of Group Corporate Citizenship at Standard Bank and also co-chair of the Principles for Responsible Banking, which is convened by the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative. And to my right, we have Daniel Hanna. He is the Global Head of Sustainable Finance at Barclays. And actually, I'm afraid Daniel is going to have to leave us for a flight quite soon. So I'm going to kick off with a question for Daniel so that we don't run the risk of missing out on his input. So Daniel, could you give us some of your thoughts about, why is it important for banks in emerging markets and developing countries to sign up to something like the Net Zero Banking Alliance or, to commit to net zero? Does it really matter? I mean, many people would say what's important is the big global banks like Barclays to sign up and to kind of take that on. And it'd just be interesting to get your perspective on some of your experience really of rolling out net zero approaches in developing country operations that you've been involved with over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for the invitation to this very important and I think very timely panel given COP and with such a distinguished group of other speakers as well. So just as I guess start with a bit of context, Barclays was one of the very first banks to come out with a net zero commitment and published its methodology, Blue Track, several years ago, which was effectively our way of being very transparent around how we were going to take our operations, our financed emissions, i.e. the emissions that are created through our own lending practices, effectively a bank's scope 3, and align that with net zero over a period of time. We've subsequently come out with targets for 2025 in terms of reducing emissions to power, to energy, and 2030 for cement and steel. And so I think our experience in putting that through is it actually then creates a framework in which we both can look through in terms of our own operations, but then also engage with our clients and our other stakeholders in what this transition is going to be. And so, Sarah, to your question, I think it's incredibly useful and important that banks in developing markets also think through this. And I salute the members of the panel here of being sort of the pathfinders very much in the African continent in terms of this space. The planet is not going to achieve net zero unless we achieve a just transition. And I think we heard a little bit about that from Her Excellency earlier from one aspect, which is, I think has been much remarked on this week, Africa has generated 3% of global emissions, yet accounts for 1/5 of the global population. And so there is an element of, if you like, a just transition, which refers to this climate justice. I think as the IEA's Faith Birol put out, solving gas in Africa is not even in the top 100 things necessarily that the planet needs to do to achieve net zero. There is, however, a second aspect of a just transition, which I think is really crucial for Africa, which is the issue around stranded communities. Because to achieve a just transition, we also need to make this a human-centered transition, and one where we don't leave communities left behind as the world shifts away from fossil fuels. And I think particularly in an African context where many communities are dependent on fossil fuels, whether it's in terms of local livelihoods or high exports for their countries, we need to think and make sure that we're not creating problems now that actually surface in 5-10 years as global demand for fossil fuels starts switching away. And I think to pick up on something that Dr. Dalia was saying, the potential of Africa to really accelerate in clean energy is enormous. It has 60% of the world's solar capacity, 60%, and is currently using 1% of that. It is using 1% of its total wind capacity. And so as we think about the opportunities, not just in clean energy, but also in hydrogen, 5,000 tons of hydrogen capacity, green hydrogen in the African continent, how does Africa make the most of that opportunity, I think is absolutely critical. So it's a very long-winded start to where do the roles of banks come into that? Well, I think from a bank's perspective, particularly in a developing economy, they are critical to the capital allocation within that economy. Both internationally, obviously, global banks can play a role in terms of sharing our experiences and learning from the reality on the ground. And I think that's what we hope to do with our Blue Track methodology. But local banks can also play a critical role in providing that information around what that transition pathway is, and then finding ways to create capital that can accelerate that transition to achieve a just transition as well. And so really what I think the NZBA does is help provide that framework to make those kind of assessments and then ultimately make those kind of credit and capital allocation choices.
Thank you, Daniel. And if I can just follow up, I think one of the roles of major international banks is that you actually bank for many smaller regional and local banks. And maybe I could just get your thoughts in terms of that banking relationship. How will you be thinking about the climate issues in that, whether it's from a climate risk perspective or from an alignment or an opportunities perspective?
Is it on? Sorry, apologies for that. I think it's a great question. So I think first of all, as I mentioned, the proprietary bit of work that Barclays developed, Blue Track, are a way of looking at how you assess and analyze. It's something that we've engaged many of our clients who are also banks in and will continue to do so. And we're very open in terms of, it's not perfect. I think there are lessons to be learned, but it is one way of doing it. And if it helps accelerate our clients who are banks and the way that they can start putting it into their operations, I think that's fantastic, right? This is not something that we're trying to solve for ourselves. We're trying to put it out so the industry can completely solve as well. I think the other thing that is absolutely key is, as you say, there are increasing focuses, particularly from a regulatory and prudential perspective, in terms of assessing the amount of climate risk that a bank has in its balance sheet. If you look at what the UK has done and other international centers, increasing this focus. And so this assessment of climate risk, it's not necessarily just on banks, it's on governments, it's on corporates particularly. And how a bank will incorporate that over time is also becoming an increasingly important way of how an international bank assess where it allocates capital. And so from that aspect, it's clearly helpful if the client, whatever institution, company they may be, it's actually not just helpful, it's actually critical that they have now got in place a transition plan that aligns with what Barclays and the international perspective of how that net zero kind of plays out. So it is definitely a important area of interaction with our clients, whether they're banks or otherwise, and I will expect it to only increase over the next coming years.
Brilliant. Really, really good insights. I'll turn now to Dalia, if I may. Dalia, CIB is one of the largest banks in Egypt, and we're all really thrilled to be visiting your country for COP27. And I'd like to just congratulate Egypt on such an amazing feat in hosting such a huge event. But, but I think that this point has already been made, but just to reiterate it, whether you look at emissions on a gross basis or a per capita basis, emissions from Africa are low. So it's about 10 tons of CO2 equivalent per capita, and many of the African states are emitting, less than 0.1 of a gigaton of greenhouse gas emissions. So for Africa, is it so much? How important is it to be decarbonising these portfolios, or is it more about green investment in order to develop in a clean way? And as Her Excellency said earlier about increasing access to power and water and all of these things.
Well, first of all, I would like to welcome you all on behalf of Egypt, CIB. We're really honored to have you here at Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27. And we genuinely hope that COP27 will be kind of a turning point, because we really need to accelerate solutions and not discuss them. And we hope that a session like this will get us to implement and start enacting on ground ahead of COP28, which is also in the Emirates. So I welcome you all, and we really look forward to catalyze, accelerate action to make things happen. Talking about net zero for Africa, or decarbonization for Africa, maybe my starting point would be to. So I was not heard so far. I said I welcome you genuinely to Egypt, and we hope that COP27 will be a real turning point, because we are racing with time. Talking about decarbonization for Africa, and I'm glad, Sarah, you mentioned something we all know. We are not emitters. If Africa shuts down, the 1.5 degree is still a challenge. Starting from there, what does net zero mean for Africa? What does decarbonization mean for Africa? And I will start by CIB. Why did we join NESBA in April 2021, although it was not mandatory? It was a pure business decision, because we understood that we need to align with global trends, Paris Agreement, our strategy, we need to take this into consideration. It was about risk management, purifying our portfolio and managing it to get rid of polluting clients. And by the way, we do not turn down clients, even the polluting ones. We get them to see how to transform. The third is the revenue generation, because the potential for new projects under the decarbonization, this morning we were discussing kind of a similar topic. The private sector alone has $50 trillion of projects to address decarbonization worldwide. So if you want to grow as a bank, you need to tap into this new market, the decarbonization, the renewable, the energy efficiency market. So it's alignment, it's risk, it's revenue generation. And if we zoom on Africa, and I would say definitely, you mentioned adaptation, and right, if we talk about climate finance for Africa, it's adaptation, because currently we have 250 million inhabitants in Africa on the brink of starvation and drought. However, if we want to grow as Africa, we should not miss the decarbonization wave. Again, we have natural gas, and we have cheap, conventional polluting, but we have renewable, and that's precious. I mean, I always say that our oil is in the sky, and we really need to leverage this. And if you want to grow, you cannot grow the old way and pretend that you're growing. The metaphor I have for this, as if you're still commuting with horse and a chariot, not a car, and say, no, it's much cheaper, I'll do it that way. It's exactly like that. Our challenge is how to get Africa and African banks while they decarbonize the portfolio, they empower the clients to decarbonize and leverage the new way to grow, which is the renewable. That's the challenge. It's not that I want to be committed to net zero. It's not about reporting, Sarah, and we have been into this. It's not about reporting that we are. No, it's about how banks in Africa, and I would say the banking sector in Africa, and maybe Wendy and Daniel, I mean, being in Africa, Daniel has been in Africa for a long time. This is, relatively speaking, a very powerful and robust sector compared to other economic sectors in Africa. So we can really steer the way, drive other sectors to do the way. But the problem is, or the challenge is, we should do and assume roles more than the conventional role we used to have as banks, which is funding profitable projects. No, you are steering the way, you are steering the whole economy to identify the business case of decarbonization. And I always say it's not a commitment. For us, it was by choice and for a good reason, and we're reaping it. I mean, the Green Bond has, I think, around 50% of the projects under the Green Bond addressed energy efficiency and renewable and system optimization. Not only the Green Bond, we have another EPAP program, and it's doing very well. Once we connect with the client and identify the business case of energy efficiency and demonstrate how it cuts down the costs, how it's saving, how, he is there. So again, it's the business case for the banks, for clients, and for Africa as a whole. Adaptation remains front and center. But let us grow. I wouldn't say leapfrog because for Dr. Amani, but let's join the new wave. I mean, we want to start from where others ended. Thank you.
And Dalia, if I can just follow on from that, when you talk to your peers in banks in other developing countries, and you talk about the Net Zero Alliance, what's the reaction that you get? How do they perceive it?
Well, you know that I'm in a very critical situation because I'm chair of the Sustainable Finance Committee at the Federation of Egyptian Banks. I'm also representing Africa on the Net Zero Banking Alliance Steering Committee. And I found this very critical. Actually, Sarah, you know that I dared not approach a bank and tell them, join the commitment, right? Because we need to, as an alliance, and I shared this with you earlier, and Alex, of course, we need to communicate to them the business case. Because the first reaction would be, if my government did not commit, how come I would commit? Why would I commit to 2050? Why? I don't know why should I, and I don't know how to do it. So basically, we did not do that because we wanted to reach out with NESBA and GFANS to have a customized program for African banks to let them buy, to pitch them in. They see it. Once they see the business case, I assure you, it will be before 2050. It will be before 2030. 2050 is too distant. We will be there when it's too late, actually. If you see the business case, in 2 or 3 years' time, you will have a decarbonized financial sector. Thank you.
Exactly. And I'd like to emphasize that the near-term action that is required for the members in the alliance, because you look at 2050 and you think that's a long way off, but they are actually required to put in place targets for 2030 or sooner and really get going now. But let me turn to Wendy. Standard Bank is, I think, the largest banking group on the continent by assets, and offering financial services across, I think, 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And you've not only signed up to the Principles for Responsible Banking, you're a co-chair of it. And that really looks at sustainability in the round, much broader than only climate issues. But I wondered if you could let us know a bit about, what would your bank need to go through, or what change would you need to see to kind of entertain the idea of signing up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance? And is that something that's more sort of internal or more outward facing, or maybe a combination of both?
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you for the opportunity to join. Can you hear me? Yeah. To join this important panel today. So it's a really important question. So I don't think Standard Bank is in doubt about the business case. We have a board approved climate policy that was published earlier this year that commits us to achieving net zero across our portfolios by 2050. And we have set specific targets in certain sectors: oil, gas, thermal coal, renewable energy. And those include targets by 2030. We will be publishing a second round of commitments in March of 2023 in another set of sectors. We have done some climate risk scenario analysis, stress testing, and are in the process of setting climate risk appetite statements. So we're doing the work. And we're also getting questions from investors about why have we not signed up to NESBA? And it's a practical challenge. But unfortunately, I mean, this is the delivery COP, the implementation COP. And when you're getting into implementation, you're getting your hands dirty, the practical challenges come to the fore. And we have invested a huge amount of time, resources. We've had to use external consultants, time of leadership, time of senior business people to do this first round of work. We wanted to make sure that the commitments we made, we could stick to, that we were convinced we could take our clients on the journey with us, and also certain key stakeholders. When you operate in Africa, you operate in a village. You have to move with government. You have to move with trade unions, civil society. You can't move by yourself as a bank. And what we have found is the devil's in the detail with NESBA's requirements. We simply didn't feel that within 18 months of signing, we would be able to meet all the commitments. And we're uncomfortable making public commitments that we can't live up to. We've seen what's happened in other jurisdictions around greenwashing, where financial firms have put things in the public domain. An asset manager in Germany, offices were raided. And as someone responsible for Standard Bank's external reporting, you know, I couldn't put us in that position. So key constraints, for example, we've based our targets at the moment on exposure. So percentage exposure limits and trajectories over time of how our exposure to certain sectors is going to fall. And we are working extensively. We have joined PCAF. We're working first with oil and gas to rebase those targets around financed emissions. But the amount of work and the amount of money that's required just to do one sector, there's no way that we are in a position to do more than that within the timeframes that a NESBA commitment would require. We operate in countries where the emissions data is not available. So there's no regulatory requirements on companies, on our clients to disclose climate data. There's no regulatory requirements on clients to have transition plans in place. And I think as much power and influence as banks have, there are limits to it. There are limits to our agency when the pressures put on us and not equally on the real economy. And that's something we need to spend more time on. I think CIB is doing a fantastic job as the vanguard for Africa in NESBA. And I think, Dalia, all credit to you and your team for doing that. So I think what we would like to see is there a second best? We know what good looks like. What does second best look like? What is the track for those banks that want to do this, that know there's a business case, that are keen to do it, but face practical challenges? How do we find an on-ramp for those banks?
It's an excellent point, and I think we very much hope that the Principles for Responsible Banking provides that on-ramp and that kind of space to build that capacity and have a broad framework for sustainability within the institution. Daniel, I know you are going to have to shoot off in just a few minutes. Just wanted to turn to you in case you had any last thoughts to share with us before you have to get off.
Very kind, thank you, and apologies again for having to leave early. No, I think I would also just like to say a very big thank you to CIB and Dalia's leadership, I think, for really keeping this agenda going. And I think Wendy's comments are really interesting and I think very understandable. I would say that they're a little reflective actually of probably what the global banks were saying only a couple of years ago as well. And certainly as someone that led the net zero process through and took it through our board, the challenges that you put out there are very familiar to me. You know, concerns about data availability, concerns about the quality, concerns around the commitments that you're making when you don't have the data to be able to assess that, the questions that your board will inevitably ask when they get presented with something and say, how robust is these set of numbers? And you say, well, they're the best we can do. And so I think you're doing the right thing, which is to do the homework, absolutely. And what I would just also add is that I think this is very much a shared challenge. I think it's a shared challenge within the finance community, and it's a shared challenge with the real economy as well. And I think what it requires is the leadership of banks like yours to go out, as you say, into your communities and work with them. And so as someone that had to reach out to more than 2,000 companies across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East and present them with their emissions data, many clients said to us at the time, that's the first time that anyone had really given them those emission numbers. And they probably weren't right, to be really clear. They were our best attempt at the time. And so I think we need to keep moving, keep that commitment. And all I would say is that there's a lot of support from the global banks to see how we can help with this. I know NZBA, GFANZ, and others doing a lot of great work. I know we're going to hear about that in a second. And as you say, this is the implementation COP. Let's keep that implementation momentum going.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and I wish you a really safe trip. Thank you. So turning to Alex. Well, Alex, I mean, you've been with GFANZ from the start. I mean, you kind of built it, let's face it. And now your role is Executive Director for the mobilization of capital to emerging markets and developing countries. So it'd be great to get your reflections on how you see the role of banks in mobilizing capital to emerging markets. And maybe does that differ at all from other kinds of financial actors like institutional investors or private equity, etc.? So yeah, what are your thoughts?
Thank you very much for having us. Sarah, NZBA, UNEP-FI have been incredible partners and incredible drivers of green finance over the many, many years. But also thank you to CIB. I think, honestly, the leadership that CIB have shown over the last 18 months of being the first founding bank of MENA and one of two within Africa is pretty incredible. And you didn't just join the commitment, you actually a really active member contributing very much to all of the work that I'm about to talk about. Specifically to your question, banks are more important, I would say, in many developing countries than they are in other countries because capital markets are actually just less developed. So banks are, relative to the rest of the financial sector, more important. They also play a really crucial role in project development in a way that, for example, asset managers do not. So I think for my work on mobilizing capital to emerging markets and developing countries, banks are absolutely crucial. And I can see that from, we've got a body of work building what we call country platforms. So we're supporting the Just Energy Transition Partnerships in Indonesia and Vietnam this year, which we're hoping to announce serious progress on at the end of the year. And next year we'll be partnering with South Africa as well. And then we've also been working on NUEFE, Egypt's Nexus for Water, Food and Energy, which CIB has been very involved in as well, which is really important because it's outside the G7 process. And the G7, G20 process will always be limited. Whereas Egypt demonstrating this is how you do that. This is how you develop pools of capital, deep collaboration between the private finance, government, real economy, MDBs to drive forward the projects necessary to deliver on an NDC is going to be really helpful, because we as GFANs then stand ready to support other countries who want to do that. But if that can be a success, and it says you don't need to wait for the G7 or G20 to pick your name out of a hat, you can do it yourself. So kudos to Egypt and kudos to CIB for their involvement there. But when I look at all those projects, and we have an open invite to our members to help us deliver those investment roadmaps and those expertise, it's predominantly banks. It's really predominantly banks, because they're really interested in those early stage transactions. Interestingly, obviously, it's often the same global banks that are interested, your really massive global banks. But what they really look for, and this is why I completely agree with Dr. Dalia that this is a huge growth opportunity for local banks, is they look for local partners who are ambitious and committed to this agenda, because those local banks, those local financial institutions have the expertise, have the networks to really drive delivery on the ground. And what the global banks bring, deep pockets, pools of capital, deep levels of expertise on how you do it at a more macro level, how it's done in other countries. And one of the things that's been really useful for these processes is giving not just expertise on individual projects, but what do we need to change in the macro sense in terms of project preparation, licensing laws, power purchasing agreements, auctions, for this to really unlock capital, because the scale of the investment opportunity is huge. So I think Daniel mentioned earlier 3 trillion for net zero for Africa. I think that 3 trillion is actually to deliver on the NDCs of Africa by 2030, which is 300 billion a year. And we're currently at 30 billion a year. So we need to 10x the levels of investment into Africa for them to be able to develop or deliver on their NDC. So that's a huge investment opportunity. I think this COP has shown that people are ready to implement. They want to roll up their sleeves and start implementing and stop making commitments. And that's really exciting. And I think with leadership like CIB and others, and we've got a lot of work I can talk about, not maybe when you ask me later, to bring in other local leaders from across the continent, West Africa, Anglophone, East Africa, Francophone, West Africa, Francophone, East Africa, Southern Africa, because it's all quite different. The economies are different. Some countries like Gabon are basically already net zero, and it's about how can we give them the capital such that they can develop in a clean way. So it's not about leapfrogging. They're already ahead of the advanced economies in terms of their climate deliveries, but they need that investment to be able to grow in a clean way. So there's lots of exciting work I think we're going to do next year on developing this network. This year, starting, well, it's already started. I will say that our first Africa board meeting, inaugural Africa board meeting of GFANs happened on Tuesday. And Hussein Abaza, the CEO of CIB, was on that board along with the CEO of a few other financial institutions, the African Development Bank, chaired by Mahmoud Mahildin. So that was really exciting. They approved our work plan, our 3 priorities for next year, which are scaling carbon markets, scaling project preparation and supporting clean project preparation in Africa, and capacity building with our partners like PRB, UNEP FI, to help local institutions seize those opportunities we've been talking about.
Alex, can we just drill in a little bit into the project preparation and project development side of things? Because I've heard it said this COP. I mean, we've been very interested in the ideas of blended finance, ways to sort of manage the distribution of risk across the transaction to make it palatable and bankable for banks, and how to leverage the public finance through private finance. But I've heard it said that one of the issues is kind of the pipeline of bankable projects. So it's kind of before then. Well, yes, we can do blended finance, but it's actually it's the step before and having that pipeline. How do we kind of build that in a more efficient way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think these country platforms that I've been talking about are really interesting because it is a domestically generated investment roadmap or like climate strategy. And then to deliver on that climate strategy, it begins to get tied to real projects. But I think there's often, I sometimes say this, banks and financial institutions won't invest in projects if they're not profitable. Even if we say you must invest in this country or you must invest in that project, they're not going to do it unless it's profitable because that's their mandate. That's, the fiduciary duty, etc. So it's up to us, all of us working this space, to make those projects profitable. And that requires a few things. Sometimes it requires changes to the enabling environment, the licensing laws that I talked about. If it takes 10 years to build a renewable energy project, a bank's not going to invest in it because the risk is too high. So what these country platforms provide an opportunity to do, and there was a question on it when we were talking to Her Excellency earlier, from Daniel, is I think three things. One is deeper collaboration between finance, the real economy, and governments. Two, better use of donor, concessional, and risk capital. So it's not competing with private finance, it's actually crowding in private finance. And that will require those types of institutions to take more risk and use new deploy more frequently financial products like guarantees, equity, rather than A to B loans, which banks can do. And then third is partnering, I think, with donors and philanthropies to support local countries, domestic governments, to turn nearly bankable projects into bankable projects. And that sometimes requires quite expensive engineering consultants, financial experts consultants, legal consultants to get the data and the paperwork in place. So like a large global firm like Barclays can come along and say, okay, I'm now confident enough that this project has all of the legal financial documents in place that I'm ready to invest in it. And sometimes that requires support from NDBs, DFIs, and philanthropies. And that's what we're working on.
That's a great point, that there are so many stakeholders in this equation that need to be brought together and coordinated. Dalia wants to follow up.
I mean, your wish, it just realized yesterday. I hope you joined us in the first panel. We launched on behalf of financial institutions in Egypt, Brain Trust. Brain Trust is a new approach whereby financial institutions assume a new role to prove the investability of adaptation projects in food and water by having a new ecosystem that includes de-risking partners. We have the Islamic Development Bank with us. We have multilateral development banks, the African Development Bank. We have science with us. We have technology. I mean, the whole ecosystem that makes investing in food and water profitable and appealing for global investors, along with a long list of criteria to be attended, like the project design. We need to make sure it generates revenue, like innovation in instruments, whether it's a bond, sustainability-linked loan, blended, the structuring of the project, the data, everything that's needed, because we need to entice global investors to come and invest in adaptation projects. We can no longer wait for public funding to flow. And because even if public funding or the commitments deliver, they do not suffice. They are like 10% of global funding. So if we want to attend adaptation or mitigation, it's the private. So we were totally there supporting, and I think it's the new mandate of financial institutions. The initiative or the program is Brain Trust. It's about brainstorming, and I think we'll collaborate with you on WAFI to make sure it's really appealing and enticing and addresses the risk-adjusted returns of investors. We don't want investors to compromise investing in food and water. So I think this is forthcoming, and I hope this will address your point. Thank you.
Thank you.
There was also another announcement coming out of Egypt that should be helpful. Dr. Rania, who is the Minister for International Cooperation, I think on Wednesday launched the handbook for middle and low income countries to access blended finance, how to engage with MDBs, how to use that to scale private finance, which is a really good document. So I recommend people read that.
That sounds really interesting. I think what we really do need is, less of these really long reports and more of these like very succinct how-to kind of manuals and recipe books, as I like to think of them, very practical type of guidance. So Wendy, I wanted to ask you more. I think you mentioned earlier about, talking to your clients about these issues. And I just wondered if you could let us know a little bit about, how those conversations are going and whether your clients are really interested in talking about climate issues and the net zero transition, or whether you're still kind of greeted with sort of blank faces and why on earth are you asking us about that? You're our bank, that kind of question. And how are you thinking about kind of helping your clients with, with their transition plans and really thinking about the opportunities, seizing those opportunities from the transition?
Well, client engagement is critical to this, to achieving net zero, because banks on their own are small, negligible emitters. It's what we finance that's the challenge. So we just recently, last month, we held our second client summit for clients. And what we did is we bring together clients, hopefully potential clients, governments in Africa, and academics, and we have a day, and we talk about these issues, and we look at both the risks and the opportunities around this. We look at mitigation and we look at adaptation. And we have some tough conversations. We had we had the vice president of Nigeria, and we had the president of Uganda speak. And we talked about we have economies in Africa that are dependent on hydrocarbons. We have new discoveries of gas in Namibia. We have gas in Mozambique, and we have oil in Uganda and Tanzania. And there is a very, very strong view in Africa that we should be allowed to use these resources to industrialize, and that African people deserve to have lives with dignity. They have legitimate needs and aspirations, and that transition is, the very word means to change over a period of time. And so in the short term, we will see an increase in emissions from Africa, but we will also see it plateau and then start to go down, in line with the principle of the Paris Agreement of a common but differentiated responsibility. And our clients are very much part of those conversations. So there's a lot of opportunities that they see to decarbonize. And we are providing green bonds, sustainable bonds. We're also providing sustainability-linked loans. So we've got some big corporates that operate in Africa, where we are providing these performance-based loans to them, linked to things like energy efficiency, renewable energy, recycling of packaging, plastics, and so on. And we're seeing that that's going to grow and grow. So we really see this as an incredible business opportunity. Standard Bank has just turned 160 years old. And we say, if we want to be around in another 160 years, we need a continent, a planet that has clean air, water, etc. But it also needs people who are thriving as well. So that's why, a just energy transition for Africa is really, really critical. But what we are doing is we are taking our clients on this journey. We bank a lot of the big carbon emitters. We bank Eskom, the big power utility in South Africa. We bank coal mining, which is a very, very big industry in South Africa. And we can't turn around to clients that we've got long relationships with over years and years and years and say to them, well, in 5 years' time, sorry, we're not going to bank you anymore. I don't think Dahlia spoke about this. It's about working with them. So we did a big deal in South Africa. Those that you know its history will know that there's a lot of emphasis on economic empowerment of previously disadvantaged people, and that involved the sale of a big coal mining asset to a Black-owned company. And we financed that, and there was a lot of criticism. Why are you financing coal? But 3 months later, we were able to go public that a big part of that deal, that transaction, was actually a massive renewable energy facility as well. So we have to take clients with us on the journey. And that means we have to work at a certain pace, and we have to be responsible. We can't just exit relationships. That's not going to help anyone, because other less responsible funders will come in if there's money to be made. That's the reality. So it's about conversations, it's about stakeholder engagement, it's about partnerships.
Yeah, and I know, Alex, in GFunds, you've done a lot on responsible retirement of carbon-intensive assets like this, because as we all know, divestment doesn't necessarily lead to real-world decarbonisation. Could you tell us a bit about, how you're thinking about that very, very difficult bit of the equation?
Yeah, so I think, just if you follow the life of an asset that is divested, more than 50% of the time, their emissions increase. The operating life of the asset is extended because someone who cares about net zero has divested it into someone's hands who doesn't. Methane flaring can increase, and these assets are just run less responsibly. But it is also true that if we're going to not destroy the planet and keep global heating to less than 2 degrees, and ideally 1.5, we're going to have a lot of stranded assets in our hands, even existing infrastructure. And that's not to say that over the next 10, 20, 30 years, there'll be no fossil fuels and there'll be no financing of fossil fuels, but that existing reserves and assets of fossil fuels will be stranded in a 1.5 and 2 degree world. So given that we know divestment doesn't work, we need to find a way for net zero committed financial institutions to be able to retire those assets in a responsible way that is fair to the communities, the workers who work there, the communities who are powered by those assets, but also that works for the planet. So we need to develop guardrails that say this is what responsible retirement looks like, and actually sometimes the approach of climate organizations who aren't financial experts isn't actually that helpful, because the push to divest assets hasn't been helpful, and the focus on absolute financed emissions reduction is actually wrong sometimes, because we actually need financial flows, investment into heavy industry if we're going to decarbonize it. We need 100 trillion roughly of investment if we're going to achieve net zero. Of that, I think it's 3 trillion in Africa. So that's huge increases investment into energy sector, into concrete. So your finance emissions will increase in the short run. So we're developing guardrails, we're developing frameworks that says, okay, being a net zero institution isn't just about investing in wind turbines and solar panels. It's also about supporting real economy firms that need to decarbonize. So what are those guardrails? And we issued our transition planning guide framework delivered to this COP. We've got, as you say, a work stream on the managed phase out of high emitting assets. But this is also central to those country platforms and just energy transition partnerships I talked about earlier. Eskom is a huge example. So as I said, Africa is not homogenous. Some countries are basically almost net zero already because of their natural assets, their forests and low emissions. But some countries like South Africa have huge coal dependency. So how do we use concessional finance, donor finance, private finance to move South Africa off coal in a way that's fair to South Africa, where there's still not great access to energy? Everyone accepts that South Africans deserve energy just as much as Americans. So it's not about flipping a switch. It's about developing the frameworks that allow financial institutions to support a just energy transition. And I think it's really important work. And just one more thing on that, I think we're going to have to develop a way that allows, if you shorten the life of a coal plant by 20 years, where's that capital going to come from? And there's some interesting work going on about how you can set up a really high integrity way for that transaction to generate carbon credits. It's not there yet, but I think it's really important work.
Okay, so avoided emissions credits, yeah. And I think there's so far to go with the voluntary carbon markets in order to have greater robustness around that, and like you say, guardrails around how those credits are used by banks or real economy companies in the transition. So Dalia, just coming back to you, I think this conversation has revealed that this transition is really complex. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot of stakeholders that are coming at it from different angles. If we in the Net Zero Banking Alliance at UNEP FI and at GFANZ, we are here to support the financial sector, the private finance in sort of driving that agenda. What are the sort of activities that you think we should be doing to really help that and to facilitate that for banks across MENA and Africa?
Yeah. I think, Sarah, with the UNEP FI architecture of NESBA, TCFD, UNEP, the PRB, Wendy is our chair on the PRB, I represent the MENA region. These are very precious frameworks. The publications, the guidelines are very precious. And this is something to leverage on. And now the GFANZ, you complement the picture. And I'm very glad that the discussion got us from decarbonization to mobilization of funding, investment, because they are two sides of the same coin. And all of you represent this, I would say, constituency necessary for the system transformation, I would say. It's adaptation, it's mitigation, it's financial flow, and they're all the same thing. And I'm very glad, Wendy, you're very honest, and I really appreciate Standard Bank reaction to NESBA. You believe in NESBA, but you are credible enough to say we need to do our homework before we join. And this is very credible. But this is very indicative that a bank as powerful as Standard Bank, South Africa is far ahead compared to any other African countries. I think 70% of climate finance instruments come from South Africa. So when Standard Bank makes the statement, we have to stop and see, how can we accommodate other African banks who are not as mature and powerful as a bank? CIB, and let me be very honest, we committed to net zero because we believe in it. In this report, that we only declared our baseline scenario. We identified the sectors. However, we did not declare targets because we believed there's still homework to be done. The emissions factor, and I was talking to my engineer, Wala, who's an environmental specialist in our team, and she says, this is tedious. And I'm very proud we have environmental specialists within the Sustainable Finance Department at CIB. And she says, we're not yet. Give us a couple of months. We need to be there. And I respect that. But again, we are Egypt's largest private sector bank. So imagine for the rest. What I want to say, we have the ecosystem. And I want to make two announcements. The Central Bank of Egypt, a week earlier, made sustainable finance mandatory for all banks, right? Including climate change risk and climate change products. So Egypt developed or announced its climate change strategy. The ecosystem in Egypt, and this applies to other African countries that issued their national adaptation projects. The ecosystem is very ripe, and you are there. We just need to customize the literature for African banks. And we need to integrate the PRB, because the PRB is like a framework how to embrace sustainable finance until we get to climate change mitigation adaptation. I can see the synergies and the coherence, but we need, as UNEP-FI bodies, the GFANs, to sit together and customize an induction program for all 54 banks. And I think this should come right after the session coming out from COP27 Sharm el-Sheikh, the GFANs. You already announced the GFANs African Network, and you had the advisory board meeting 2 days ago. And this is very precious, and it's chaired by climate champion Dr. Mahmoud Mohiddin. CIB is there on the advisory board. Wendy, you are chairing the PRB board. You are wearing so many hats, Sarah. So we really need to connect the dots, but we need to eye and target banks in Africa, 54 banks. I think there's a great potential to enact things, and we celebrate it in COP28. Thank you.
I completely agree with that. And just to say, one of our goals for, well, this year, but particularly next year, is to reduce those transaction costs for bank like Standard Bank. That's the work of GFANs to, you know, yes, it's really hard to come up with a baseline. Yes, it's really hard to come up with a transition plan. Yes, it's hard to understand how to use sectoral pathways or things like that. So how do we, but it's the same activity for lots of different banks, and there's returns to scale, and you can, and that's what we're there to do. And I know UNEP-FI are there to do, and we've agreed, you know, we've made a formal agreement that GFANs, UNEP-FI, PRI will work together on this mission to reduce those transaction costs, collaborate on our capacity building programs. And I think, as you say, there's a huge opportunity next year to make a lot of progress there.
Just fine, very quickly. I think that I totally agree with both comments. I think being a founding signatory of Principles for Responsible Banking, one of the things that really works well in that is the peer learning, the ability to learn from other banks. Sometimes there are banks that are further ahead of you. Sometimes it's banks in the same place as you. But that ability to sit with people who've gone through this and have got the scars of the process of taking their banks through these processes is invaluable. It's well worth any membership fee that you pay. It's much more valuable than anything you'll pay a consultant and so on. So I think looking at how we can work together on peer learning, on almost like a buddy, a mentoring system of some kind as well, I think that could really, really help bring more people into the NESBA fold.
That's a great idea. Some fantastic points there. Well, I think I was going to come to the audience for questions, but I think we've pretty much run out of time now. So sorry not to give you that opportunity, but I would just like to thank our amazing panel, Dr. Dalia and Alex and Wendy. Thank you so much, because you've shared with us your expertise. Thank you for your leadership. And also thank you for, you know, speaking in such an open and frank manner about some of these issues, which are really difficult, that we're all really trying to overcome together. So thank you so much. If everybody could thank them.